Hello. In this section, we are going to speak about brain circulation, and we are going to speak basically about the blood supply in the brain and how the blood supply supports the brain and what areas in particular are supplied by what arteries. So let's begin. We'll just go back to the start. So generally, the basic facts about the brain and how it works. The brain, even though it is 2% of the body, of the weight of the body, it consumes approximately 20% of its oxygen, and it consumes anywhere between 15 and 20% of basically the food supply that you get. You will find the number 20% more consistent in the past research because a lot of this research was done based on the squid. There's a special neuron that the squid has. But human beings are more efficient, so the brain consumes a little bit less. This is based at least on some research that came out a few years ago. So the brain requires the circulation of the blood frequently, and just to give you an idea, about three quarters of a liter to 1 liter of blood circulate through the brain every minute. Now, guess what? How much blood do you have in your body? You have approximately 3.75 of a liter, so 3 liters and 3 quarters. So imagine more than just approximately about a quarter of that just goes into the brain. And of course, this is just the average, and you can maximize the amount of blood that flows into the brain through physical activity. Increasing your physical activity will make your brain more efficient because it, number one, it enables the brain to get rid of the waste, metabolic waste, and number two, it enables the brain, to build new structures and to become more plastic. So physical activity in every way increases brain performance and enhances the ability of the brain to rebuild itself. So out of this amount of blood that flows into the brain, approximately 70% of it is carried by the carotid artery, the internal carotid artery, and the rest, or 100 to 200 milliliters, are basically carried by the vertebral system, which we will speak about. And so as you look on the brain structure, the cerebral cortex is going to consume approximately 4 times more energy, blood than the other areas below, which are the gray the white matter. And the reason, as I explained in class, is that the cerebral cortex primarily includes cell bodies and glial cells. And remember, glial cells carry the food. Some of them carry the food to the neurons, and they do a lot of maintenance and function. So they do also have a lot of requirement for oxygen and glucose and so on. And beneath, then you have all these axons coming down to make the white matter, and the white matter doesn't consume as much blood, doesn't require as much as the gray matter. So oxygen deprivation is called anoxia, and anoxia is again, it deprives the brain of oxygen based on say how long and based on how severe the deprivation is. That is going to determine what kind of symptoms the person has and to what extent and how long these symptoms will stay and if they will be permanent or not. Obviously, the longer they are and the more involved they are, the more serious the symptoms. So oxygen deprivation in some times for seconds and sometimes for minutes. It's based on what kind of cells are deprived. For example, the pyramidal cells are big, gigantic cells, mostly in the frontal lobe of the brain, and they can last a little bit longer than other cells that might last for 1 second or 2 seconds. So it depends on what kind of cell we are speaking about, and but in any case, the longer it takes for that anoxia, and the more severe it is, the more likely the person will have serious effects that might last for a long time or maybe even permanent. So the main functions of blood circulation: blood and the blood vessels serve as a system of rivers, and rivers basically enable you to carry supplies from town to town, from area to area, and they branch off into little branches and so on. So the blood vessel system is our, let's call it the Red River, as my chemistry professor used to call it, that it carries all the nutrients to the different parts of the body. At the same time, it enables, or it carries the waste that these parts of the body discard. It goes into the bloodstream, and finally it finds its way to your kidneys and then outside. So one of the functions, again, two primary functions of the blood circulation is that blood carries oxygen, glucose, and other nutrients that the brain cannot survive without. And the second part is to enable the brain to get rid of its waste, and all this metabolic waste finally finds its way to the bloodstream, and then it goes out. So most of the waste is carbon dioxide, lactic acid, and some other metabolites that are, tiny parts of molecules that are discarded. So all the blood in the brain comes from two sources. First one is the internal carotid artery, and the second one is the vertebral artery. And as these enter the skull, and they go onto penetrate the dura of the brain, then they branch off. Some branches are superficial, right on top of the brain itself, and then they make branches that go deeper and go into the tissue inside and lower areas that will will supply these areas on a deeper level. So you hear the word superficial mentioned in context of some of the branches, and deeper you also hear it. So here, the carotid artery, there's a common carotid artery that is going through the neck, and when it comes like low to the posterior, beneath the posterior segment of the jaw, we call this the ramus of the mandible, that vertical piece. Beneath it a little bit, then you are going to find that at that level, the common carotid artery is going to branch into two branches. One is going to be the external carotid artery that goes to the parts of the face, and then the internal is going to rise, and it will find there's a tiny hole in the skull that has its name. It says the internal carotid artery foramen. That's the opening in through the skull through which the internal carotid artery enters the skull. Then it goes into the dura of the brain. Remember, the dura consists of the dura mater, and pia mater, arachnoid, and the pia mater. So it goes into the dura and it branches off. So this internal carotid artery, as it goes in on the surface, superficial pieces, you have the anterior cerebral artery, because now we are speaking about the cerebrum. So anterior cerebral artery that you could see here. And then you have the middle cerebral artery, and that really covers a huge area. Basically, all of these areas here, especially if you are speaking about the left hemisphere, this is of course the right. If you are speaking about the left hemisphere, you are gonna include just about most of the language areas, because along this lateral fissure on the other side, on the left side, you are going to have, actually the left side is here for this patient, you are going to have Wernicke's area, and you are going to have Broca's area, and you're going to have the angular gyrus and the auditory primary auditory cortex, and all these areas that are required for communication. And you could see here on the right, on your right, this blue area is called the anterior carotid artery. That is the area that is supplied by this little branch. That's the anterior cerebral artery here. And it basically goes, the segment that is between, that's next to the, what do you call it, the longitudinal fissure. And you could see that it supplies the gray matter, it supplies the white matter, it supplies the anterior part of the corpus callosum. So that is the domain for that. And then the posterior and the middle cerebral artery area, that is, all this brown area here. Sorry, the image is flipped, so it doesn't say the word. I mean, the words are backwards. So the internal carotid artery is going to supply the two hemispheres of the brain, and as it goes in, it's going to each one is going to go to one side, right and left, and then at some point it starts to give off branches, different branches to feed different, supply different areas. So again, as it goes up into the brain, it's going to split into the anterior cerebral artery, because we are speaking about the cerebrum, and the middle cerebral artery, and we'll see what happens to these two. So generally, the anterior cerebral artery supplies the cerebral cortex, the white matter, I mean the cortex itself, that layer on top, and then the white matter beneath it, and of the inferior frontal lobe. So you have the frontal lobe like this. Inferior is the area, the kind of beneath and underneath. So then it also the medial surface of the frontal and parietal lobes are also supplied by this artery. Then you also include the anterior corpus callosum, as you saw in the image, the first part of the corpus callosum that is innervated, supplied by this blood vessel. And we are going to speak about other ones later that are going to supply the posterior corpus callosum. So at some point, a branch will come off the anterior cerebral artery, and that is called the recurrent artery of Hebner, and that supplies the deeper parts of the cerebrum and the diencephalon. Remember, the diencephalon means two. The two, basically, encephalon means brain. So two structures brain structures, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And also it supplies the head of the caudate nucleus that's part of the basal ganglia. And the anterior limb of the internal capsule, that is an area that's between the thalamus and the basal ganglia where some motor neurons pass through. So you could see now on this map, you can see the regions, the territories of the anterior cerebral artery. This is one view, and this is a sagittal view. You could see inside if you break open the two hemispheres. So if you open the two hemispheres like this, you are going to see that this whole area here, this whole area from the frontal lobe from here, and all these areas here inside, these are supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. So this is what you are looking at here. And when you look this way, this is the area from the frontal lobe from here, and you go down all this slice of the brain, of the frontal lobe here, all the way to the very end. Okay. So that will be, the anterior. This is what anterior is, the front. It has to do with the front of the brain, the anterior, and then cerebral. It has to do with the cerebral cortex. And second. Okay. So, and the middle, you can see again, it's that area where language, basically most language comprehension, expression, and reception is in this area for the left hemisphere. And then the posterior we'll speak about, that comes out of the vertebral, and that supplies the posterior parts of the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum as well. So you could see here parts of the anterior cerebral artery, the recurrent artery of Hebner, or Hubner, maybe. It goes through the anterior perforated substance, and it supplies the basal ganglia and the internal capsule. The internal capsule is the area that these radiating structures come out of. These are called the corona radiata, and they just come out of between the thalamus and the basal ganglia, and that space is called the internal capsule. And of course, it has some tissue and structure there. So the emphasis again is the anterior limb, so the front, because that is an anterior branch, and then the posterior is going to be supplied by different arteries. Now we speak about the middle cerebral artery, that one that covers most of the language areas in the left hemisphere, and I'm saying left hemisphere frequently because in case you do not know, 95% of individuals all over the world have language fundamentals, means grammar, vocabulary, phonemes, sounds. They are stored and processed in the left side of the brain, so in the left hemisphere. And the 5% that remain, who are left-handed individuals, the majority of these people, more than 68%, the majority of them also have language fundamentals in the left hemisphere. So, close to 98% of the population will have language fundamentals here again in the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is more responsible for the holistic whole picture, like the whole story, the whole conversation. It's also responsible for non-literal interpretations or implied utterances, things that are that require kind of, involve more metaphorical and indirect forms of speech. But it has to be able to perform that function. It has to rely on the whatever is available in the left hemisphere, because in that case, that's the raw material that it has, that it has to go to. So the middle cerebral artery supplies most of the white matter of the hemisphere. Let's go back again here. You could see this is the entire hemisphere, but most of the white matter, the majority of that, is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. So that includes the frontal lobe, the temporal and the occipital lobes, and the insula that I showed you is buried underneath the opercula in this, this area here. So then the penetrating arteries, so this is the surface, but the other ones that go inside deeper into the organ, the tissue, they include the lenticulus striate arteries, and they supply deeper white matter, and they also supply the diencephalon structures, for example, including the posterior limb of the internal capsule. You notice in the anterior covers the anterior limb, but now we speak about the posterior because that comes, it covers more areas that are in the middle, and then the putamen and the other, the outer globus pallidus, which is part of the basal ganglia, and also the body of the caudate. So this basically supplies the diencephalon also, and also the many of the basal ganglia structures. So as you could see, these are the superficial branches, and then you have the deeper ones that we were speaking about that go deeper into the white matter. So now, after the internal carotid artery emerges from the cavernous sinus, it gives off the anterior choroidal artery, and that supplies the anterior hippocampus and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. The internal capsule, again, we go back to it, that space between the thalamus and the basal ganglia. So again, this is a deeper layer, a deeper branch, and it supplies the anterior hippocampus, which is your memory processing center. You notice I don't say memory storage, because the hippocampus doesn't store memories. It only processes them for a limited amount of time, maybe an hour or maybe 65 minutes, and then that information goes to be stored somewhere else on the cerebral cortex. So again, you can see the territory now, the anterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, and then you have the posterior, that is part of the vertebral that we'll speak about later. So here is the right image, it's not flipped, and this is the anterior cerebral artery region, and then the middle cerebral artery region, and then you can see that deep branches of the middle cerebral artery go deeper here to innervate parts of the diencephalon and parts of the basal ganglia. So now let's look at the other parts of the brain and how they are innervated. When we mentioned at the beginning, we said there are two main arteries that supply the brain, the internal carotid artery and the vertebral artery. So when I say vertebral arteries, it means left and right. So let's discuss them and see how they connect with each other. So first, you can see now why we call it the vertebral, because as one of your classmates mentioned, it is threaded through the vertebrae and some of the cervical vertebrae, and it rises and as it goes into above, like the end of the vertebrae, it enters the brain through the foramen magnum, which is the hole beneath the skull. And then as it rises, then you have at some point the right branch and left branch together at some point unite into the basilar artery, and then both of them also they give off some other branches. So we're gonna go back and see what happens before they unite into the basilar artery. So every side, as you see here, say for example one side here, you see it here. Every side is going to give off an anterior spinal artery and a posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Make sure that you don't miss this. This cerebellar has to do with the cerebellum, and cerebrum or cerebral has to do with the cerebral cortex. That is the top convoluted layer of the brain. So cerebellum is here. That's a whole different structure. And then so the anterior spinal artery and the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So let's look at them. So here you have the posterior inferior cerebellar artery here, and then the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So one is here, you can see it, and one is below, and you could see now that they both have to do with the cerebellum, and particularly the inferior surface of the cerebellum. So one is going to supply the posterior part, inferior, and one is going to supply the anterior inferior structures of the cerebellum. So then they unite together, they join onto the one artery called the basilar artery or basilar artery. And then that's on the level of the pons. So then two branches will come off these that we'll discuss in a minute. So again, on the level of the pons and the medulla, which is, you can see this big piece here is the pons, and then the medulla is right beneath it. So that is the level, the junction between the medulla and the pons here. They two start to join each other, as you could see here, and they make the basilar artery. Then the basilar artery, as it keeps going up, it is going to give off two other branches, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery and then the internal auditory artery. So actually I didn't point out the anterior spinal artery. Let's see, there's an image here that should have it. The anterior, let me see, I think I might, I'm just gonna just hold with me for 1 minute. No, I don't have it here. But what it does is that it supplies part of the spinal cord, in this region here, and then it is going to continue going up. So as it goes, so here in this region here, between the two, you will find the this area here. That is the spinal piece, and it is not shown here, but it will be around here. So then, as they join into the basal artery, and it keeps going, then it gives off the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, as you could see here, and then it's going to give off, another artery, which is the internal auditory artery. Now, this is the internal auditory artery. So you go from the basilar artery, and then it gives off the anterior cerebellar artery, and then it gives off the anterior internal auditory artery, which branches into the vestibular branch and the cochlear branch. So on the level of the midbrain, the basilar artery is going to split. It's going to give off the two posterior cerebral arteries, and you could see it here, the posterior cerebral artery. So it will be one on the right, one on the left, and after that, then we need to connect the carotid artery structures with the vertebral artery systems in the brain, and that is going to be the circle of Willis that you see here. It's like a circle, and this is where the two structures that supply the brain all unite and connect. So the posterior cerebral arteries supply, number one, the inferior temporal cortex. Let's go back and we'll show you where the middle cerebral artery ends. See, its territory ends on the middle of the temporal cortex. So it covers the superior area that has the auditory cortex and parts of the auditory association cortex, and it has Wernicke's area, and it has the anterior pole of the temporal lobe. But the lower half of the temporal cortex is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery that comes again off the basilar artery that is branched, that eventually comes from the vertebral artery. So then it also supplies the medial occipital lobes. The occipital lobes are in the back. They are, where's my brain? So the occipital lobes, left and right, because we have two branches, left and right. And also remember what artery supplies the anterior corpus callosum. Remember it. Now we look at the second half of the posterior corpus callosum. The artery that supplies it is the posterior cerebral artery. So we are speaking so far about the superficial, branches, and then out of these you have penetrating branches that go deeper into the hemispheres, and you get the thalamo-perforate. There's an area called the perforated substance, and the thalamus. So the thalamo-perforate area, branch, it innervates that area, and also the thalamo-geniculate arteries. Remember the geniculate body that is dedicated to the processing of hearing signals when the auditory pathways go up, and then in the towards the very end where you have the signal coming from the inferior colliculus, go into the medial geniculate or the geniculate body, and that is like, it is an inferior part of the thalamus. And then the signals go from there to the primary auditory cortex and the other parts of the temporal cortex. So these areas here are supplied by the posterior cerebral arteries. So then these also supply the two posterior cerebral the two posterior cerebral arteries supply the thalamus, the subthalamic nuclei. When you look at the thalamus, I'm not sure it shows here. No, it wouldn't. If you simply say, just Google images, and you look for subthalamic nuclei, beneath the thalamus, there are two tiny nuclei, which a nucleus that is deep in the white matter is called the nucleus because it has cell bodies. And they are beneath the thalamus, inferior to it, and they're called the subthalamic nuclei. And also, they supply parts of the midbrain. So now we have covered all the blood supply arteries in the brain, and now we are going to look at the interconnections, how the two systems are interconnected. And there's a reason for that. That is basically to protect the brain against damage, if, as much as possible, if there's blockage in or malfunction in one area, then the blood is not shut off, and then you can get blood from other areas. So the area that connects is the circle of Willis. So it's located, when you look, it is located on basically around the top of the brain stem. And at the circle of Willis, you are going to have the anterior cerebral arteries connected to each other, and then connecting to the middle cerebral arteries, and connecting to the vertebral arteries. So, but now the anterior communicating artery connects the two anterior arteries like this. So here's one anterior cerebral artery on the other side. So here's one from this side, one from this side, and then you have that little junction in between, that is the anterior communicating artery. Then, and you can see now the recurrent artery of Hübner or Hübner, I think, here, and the other side is here. So then, you go opposite and posteriorly, you are going to find the posterior communicating artery that's going to connect basically the vertebral system with the carotid system, with the middle cerebral artery. So the posterior communicating artery connects the two posterior cerebral arteries with the internal carotid artery. And now you have the circle of Willis. As it is said, neurologists will tell you that no one has a perfect circle of Willis. It's just because there are many irregularities there, and the circle of Willis is often a place that is likely to have atherosclerosis or things accumulating there, because it has many angles and things like that. So that is the circle of Willis. Follow this video, please, and it will tell you a little bit about strokes and the different types. Basically, there are two groups of strokes. A stroke is an accident inside of the brain that involves malfunctioning of a blood vessel. That malfunctioning can be occlusion, or mean like blockage, or it can be rupturing of a blood vessel. Think about the blood supply in the brain. It's just like the structure of a tree. Larger, like when you look at the aorta. Aorta is a big, gigantic artery coming out of the heart. And out of it you have the subclavian, a smaller artery. And then out of that you have smaller. As you go up, you have smaller and smaller and smaller branches naturally. So someone might have, say, a blood clot or a piece of plaque the size less than a grain of sand. If it is found in a larger artery, it doesn't necessarily now cause a problem. It flows around because it is not going to plug that artery. However, because blood pressure is driving the blood up, that little grain of sand is going to be traveling up, or that little piece of clot is going to be traveling up through the bloodstream, and it will keep going through branches, blood vessels, arteries, and these become smaller and smaller and smaller until that tiny structure that is less than a grain of sand reaches a blood arteriole, small, very small blood vessel, and then it is not big enough to make it pass, and then it gets jammed through it and it shuts it down. So that is going to cause an infarction or an infarct. So it's like, say, you have an area here that is supplied by this blood vessel. So imagine my hand, this is a blood vessel, and it branches off and it feeds one area. And then all of a sudden you just shut down. You have something inside that plugs the whole thing inside, and this whole area now has no blood, no oxygen. So the entire area that is supplied by these branches are going to, that whole entire area will die. Neurons will be killed, will die. Glia, everything. What you have is an area that has a lot of dead tissue around, and that is called an infarction or an infarct. That results from a stroke. So a stroke is a type of cerebrovascular accident inside of the brain, and that results from, number one, either occlusion of a blood vessel or a rupturing of a blood vessel. The occlusion is caused by two kinds of problems. Number one, atherosclerosis, and number two, a thrombosis. These two are related to each other, and I'll explain how. And then the rupturing part is a hemorrhage, a brain hemorrhage. And that hemorrhage can be caused by two things too. Either high blood pressure simply just makes a piece of the wall of a blood vessel just burst, and then the blood leaks out, and it's gonna create a pool that's going to put a lot of pressure on brain tissue. It causes herniation. Herniation is, you can think of it as if you think about brain tissue as consistency of toothpaste, just like toothpaste. When you squeeze it out and it make it go out of its place, then that is herniation. That is now herniation. So squeezing that out of its place, that's what we call herniation. And because of the softness of the tissue, the brain tissue, when you put pressure, when there's a pool of blood and the arteries, of course, are pumping more and forcing the blood through, it's going to push down on, it will create that pool, and that will displace a lot of, brain tissue away, and it will actually, the blood has toxic materials that are toxic to the tissue of the glia, and also the cell bodies of the neurons. So it will kill them. And in addition, it is going to put pressure, and it will displace structures from where they are, and eventually have, say, even if it's subdural, beneath the dura, on the surface, if that rupturing is, it's going to, plug down. You'll see it in the video. It's going to push down brain structures. The brain, the skull is shaped like a funnel. Larger areas on top, smaller areas below. So if you put pressure above, we are going basically to push down areas that need a large space into smaller spaces, and that is going to cause shearing and cutting and severing of axons and displacement. It will be a big mess if it is significant. If it's a huge problem, a huge vessel, it could cause death. So immediately, in that case, the person should be rushed. He should call 911. And in that case, they will drill a hole in the skull, and they drain that blood and bring it back to the body, to relieve and prevent the consequences of the damage until they repair the blood vessel. So either rupturing of a blood vessel, or as a result of high blood pressure, or rupturing of an aneurysm. An aneurysm is a weakness on the wall of a blood vessel. Like, if I blow this balloon and there's a little area that is weak, it is going to make another balloon by itself. So the blood vessel will be like this, and then you squeeze, and it will make, a weak area is going to balloon out, and it will create just a structure like this, and it will stay. This is a genetic problem. Kids are born with it, and it grows. The size of these grow with the individual. And it will be just a matter of time. At some point, it will explode. And some of the signs are like extreme headaches, migraines, that the person will say, I've never had anything like this before. So there are some serious signs. If they say, I have the headache or the migraine is so severe that I haven't had anything like this before, that is, it's a red flag. They need to have immediate attention. So that if that it ruptures, then the same, you have blood accumulation, and it's going to cause serious consequences, especially based on how big it is, if it is branching of a large artery or a small artery, and so on. Brain aneurysm. Aneurysms also develop in other parts, but what concerns us here is the brain aneurysm. So, atherosclerosis and the occlusive kind of strokes, you have a blood vessel like this. You notice that the artery is rounded, and it has thicker walls than veins, because it has, you put more pressure into it. And it has an epithelial layer inside, and then a little muscular layer around, and then connective tissue wrapping around it just to protect it. And it starts initially, if just a very, very, if one atom just sticks to the internal surface of the blood vessel, then it's going to attract other ones, and that starts to build up calcium and fibrins, and it will start to build up all kinds of junk, and it will build areas of from blood platelets, some fibrins, and it will make a plaque. The whole area that will be, covered with fat and other things that basically makes like a circle around the artery, and it keeps growing and growing, and it makes the artery itself constricted, so it doesn't allow much blood. And when you don't do that, that is raising blood pressure. So the blood is going to stream more through it very fast. And it's going to have uneven edges and all this, these pieces of plaque and cholesterol, and it's a big mess. If one tiny piece, like sometimes you have a little piece hanging there, it's called the thrombus. If any piece here that you could see, like here on the left side low, you have a little piece hanging down, that's a thrombus. Once the blood pressure dislodges it and makes it go loose, it becomes an embolus. So it becomes it causes an embolism. And that means embolus means something that flows in the bloodstream until it finds a small blood vessel, so it can plug, and once it does so, then the whole area is dead. That causes the infarction. The lining of a blood vessel inside is similar to Teflon. It is shiny. It is a non-stick material. It prevents oxidization. Oxidization, basically the accumulation of oxygen on tissue. And once you do that, like if you have a piece of metal, put it outside, iron, gradually it will attract oxygen from the air, and oxygen is going to be embedded into between the atoms of the iron, and then as it goes in, it becomes comfortable over time, and it pushes to make a crack, and then other oxygen molecules are going to go in. And as you go in, eventually that is called rusting when you speak about metal and iron. And we call it in blood, the similar process, we call it oxidization. And when you go to the store and you read all about these antioxidants, that is exactly what they target. They want you to have things that are healthy, so they do not, they strengthen that internal layer of a blood vessel, so it doesn't allow things to stick to it. So things like green tea, pomegranate juice, all these, red grape juice, cranberry, all of these red and antioxidant, things. It is many things that are around us. Food have antioxidants, and they are very healthy. They build up this layer inside, and they prevent sticking. Again, this is on the preventative side. I don't know much about now if someone already has it. Of course, it minimizes, but you would ask a physician about how this works if someone already has atherosclerosis. So this is what it looks like when, all of this debris, all this plaque accumulates. It attracts more and more and more, and it builds up until you have an occluded artery. Sometimes they put a balloon in to keep it inflated so that it can keep the blood flowing, and sometimes they have to go and have another kind of surgery. So, but again, any of these pieces that you could see, that sometimes a piece would hang down, that would become a thrombus. It will stay there. Once it is dislodged and flows freely into the bloodstream, it becomes an embolus, and it will cause an embolism, which it goes to block a blood vessel and kill the area it feeds. So strokes also can be caused by brain injuries, by toxic materials getting into the brain, by cardiac heart disease, by infections, certain kinds of infections, by tumors, by blood vessel disease, some vascular malformation, like I mentioned, the circle of Willis usually is a site where there are many malformations, some immune system diseases. So again, strokes can be caused by multiple, but the majority, of course, of these are caused by occlusive or hemorrhagic strokes that are related to the causes that we described. So a hemorrhage, in some cases, may cause a blood clot. The blood clot in the brain is called the hematoma. So, it will be somewhere within the cerebral hemispheres, and it will also it can be found in the brainstem or the cerebellum. So any of these sites can have a hematoma or a blood clot that results from a hemorrhage. The hemorrhage also causes an ischemia or an infarction. Ischemia is deprivation, oxygen deprivation, and when you deprive the tissue of oxygen, that tissue dies. So sometimes ischemia is synonymous with infarction. So again, significant the ischemia itself, it is a significant decrease in blood flow to specific parts of the brain. If that blood flow is decreased slightly, the symptoms obviously will not be severe. If the blood supply is not flowing, if the problem is slight and doesn't last long, that there would be no neurological symptoms. Basically, they will disappear. However, the longer it is and the more serious or severe it is, then the greater the damage. So the severity of the ischemia is going to determine the severity of the outcomes. If it is temporary, it may leave no neurological signs, and if it is prolonged, it will cause anoxia. Anoxia means loss of oxygen or oxygen deprivation, and also that is gonna, deprive the brain of glucose. So in addition, it will also make it difficult for the brain to remove the waste. So you have a lot of waste from metabolism accumulating, especially lactic acid. When the ischemia is prolonged again and becomes severe, it could cause permanent damage, or it will kill all the areas that are supplied by a particular blood vessel, and that area we call it an infarct or an infarction, which is a big area. Like on here, on the left side superior, you are going to have a whole area here that is an infarction. I would like you to look at this area and tell me what area this is. And I'll give you a clue. This is the temporal cortex. And if you pull this down, you are going to expose this island here. So this is part of the temporal cortex. This is part of the frontal lobe. But what part is it? And let's see. This is the person's right. No, this is the person's most likely left hemisphere, because that's a coronal cut. You're looking, you make two cuts like this, and then you could take the back piece out, and then you look at from behind, and you could see this. If that is the case, then that will be the person's left hemisphere. If you look at the other part, that you make a coronal section and take the front out, and then look from here, that could be reversed. So, but most likely it will be the left hemisphere. So we need to know what this area is. What is your prediction for what kind of damage the person will get? So again, this is an area here. If someone has any problem in this blood supply in this area, and the posterior cerebral artery region, they will have specific problems with, say, for example, with vision here, with certain memory problems, whatever areas exist here are going to be affected, and the person will show neurological signs based on that. In the territory of the middle cerebral artery, the person is going to have tremendous, especially on the left side, they will have tremendous language comprehension, language processing, language expression deficits, and because of this whole area is basically the language domain. And the anterior, of course, you are going to speak about attention, work and memory problems, and any of the functions that are mediated by the frontal lobe of the brain. So let's look at the middle cerebral artery infarctions. The middle cerebral artery, most strokes result from it. So these are some of the signs. You get contralateral weakness. So if you find the weakness, like say a hand becomes weak, or the left side, immediately you know that the problem is on the right side, and the opposite is true. And then the person would have a sensory loss, that you wouldn't be able to feel things or sense, temperature or for example, hot or cold, or also visual problems, sensory, which is visual, and also other sensory problems. And visual field impairment. The person might have difficulty seeing something on the left side or on the right side, because the eye, is, different parts of it. There's peripheral vision and there's focal vision, and sometimes the focal vision is cut, and sometimes the peripheral vision is cut. So different parts of the visual field will be affected, and based on if the damage is right or left, the person is going to have if the problem is on the left side, they will have language impairments, language disturbance, either difficulty comprehending or difficulty expressing, or both, depending on where the site is. If it's in the right hemisphere, the person will have lots of spatial perception problems. They will have difficulty finding their, locating themselves, directions, reading a map, and finding directions, basically orienting themselves in space. They will have weakness and sensory problems involving the face and the arm. No, actually, I'm sorry. The weakness and the sensory problems involving the face and the arm are less if you have are more severe than the upper arm, or the proximal parts of the arm, and also more severe than the legs. And that is because the proximal ends of the arms and the legs are more represented more on both sides of the motor cortices. So again, infarctions in the territory of the middle cerebral artery, they cause most of the common stroke symptoms. And if it is unilateral damage, involving that, it will not affect the trunk or the upper arm, just because they are represented in both cerebral, motor cortices. And they also, the damage is not going to affect the muscles of the forehead and the jaw and the pharynx, because again, these are represented in both left and right. So, so I didn't mean to say hey, but they have representations in both motor cortices. Now, if we look at the part of the middle cerebral artery that is supplying the area where certain structures exist, like Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and so on, then that is going to cause the symptoms we know as Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, or global aphasia, and so on. So the areas, if you see, remember the insula or the insular cortex, it is covered, buried, covered underneath 3 lids. That piece here that is lifted off is called the temporal operculum. And in here, you have this line here is the Rolandic fissure or the central fissure. This is the parietal cortex. This is the frontal cortex. This area here, that greenish, area, that is the temporal operculum. And the area underneath that tool in here, that is called the frontal operculum. So the frontal operculum area is basically close to and is part of Broca's area. And if there's damage there involving that branch, the blood supply here, that is going to cause Broca's aphasia. Broca's aphasia is going to cause 2 types of damage. Number 1, because Broca's area has motor programming for speech, the speech expression will be affected, because Broca's area is a processing center for grammar, for lexical, parts of the lexicon, internal vocabulary that you string into different sentences and make different sentence structures and call this noun and this verb and so on. That is part of Broca's area. So if someone has difficulty with, there's damage there, lack of blood supply here, or complete damage, that is going to cause difficulty with producing grammatical constructions. Sometimes it's called agrammatism, lack of grammar. So the person, instead of saying, I want to go to the store, they could say, I store. They take out grammatical words like between, off, on, and so on. 2, damage to, I just want to point out, see this little area here? That is called Heschel's gyri, or Heschel's gyrus, the transverse gyri of Heschel. And they have to do with hearing. And the tip of these, the superior ends of these are called the primary auditory cortex, and that area is responsible for hearing. So, if the frontal operculum is damaged because of the lack of blood supply or decrease, the person has Broca's aphasia, and that involves speaking and writing, and it also involves comprehension. That is not a primary area, but it does involve comprehension. Because if you don't comprehend grammar, it will affect your ability to comprehend speech in general. And of course, it will affect writing, because grammar is a big part of writing. If the infarction involves the posterior temporal gyrus, that we are speaking about, the top gyrus of the temporal cortex, and we are speaking about the posterior part of it, which is Wernicke's area. Let's go back. So I told you here, this is Heschel's gyrus, or gyri. And this area here is the primary auditory cortex. You continue going this way, that continues over here in this area, and then you're this area is the posterior superior temporal gyrus, and that is Wernicke's area. So the person will have Wernicke's aphasia. Wernicke's aphasia is characterized by primarily severe difficulty comprehending speech and difficulty monitoring your own speech. You're just speaking and you are making no sense whatsoever. You're just making vocalizations, but they are not matching anything that you would like to say And there's something called press of speech. The person keeps talking, even though they are not making any sense. They just keep talk. And also they will, their expressive language ability will be affected because the Wernicke's area system also helps with monitoring speech production and monitoring the content that you have and the meaning and assembling the meaning with words and so on. And before you speak, you have to do a verbal script that is going to go, and you have to make sure that everything matches what you want to say. So Wernicke's area is damaged. That was gonna cause also expressive difficulties. If the damage is widespread, for example, it involves more than one operculum, we call this global aphasia, and the person gets multiple symptoms based on the areas that this covers. So, and then damage to the lower left parietal cortex is going lower left parietal cortex is going to cause motor apraxia. So motor apraxia, the person, it's as if their organs of speech or even fingers do not follow what the person wants to do or what the person wants to say. So in a sense, this is not guessing. This is for sure that motor apraxia is an ideational problem. It means before you want to do something, you have an idea, and then you translate it into motor actions. Now, there's something that it goes wrong between your idea that you know for sure you want to say bed, and then you say it and it comes out as deb, or it comes out as da. You want to say hamburger, and then it comes out as damburger. So things just are not sequenced and they're not complete, and there are serious problems with speech, especially when we say speech motor apraxia or developmental apraxia that is part of development. Kids have it, and some other adults develop it as a result of damage, strokes and other things. So there also will be again difficulty, things that you know how to do, you cannot do. And at the same time, things that, for example, the person can close the lips like this, but they might not be able to say the p or b, for example. So they might be able to do something spontaneously, but once you tell them or they want to do it on demand, they just cannot, because they can't translate the idea to the motor cortex and get all these muscles to work together to effectively make the sound that you want to make. And in the right sequence as well. Now, let's look at the infarctions of the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere infarctions, because the right hemisphere is responsible for the overall image of things, for metaphors, for implied, speech, for subtle things, for like the whole message, a story, a whole conversation together. What is between the lines, as the old show used to say. So disturbance, blood supply interruption or abnormalities in that right hemisphere are going to cause disturbance in spatial perception. The person will have difficulty, for example, if you say, draw a clock for me. They might have a visual cut, like one half of their eye visual field is cut, and they can't see anything beyond that. So they have you show them a clock, and you give them a paper, and say, draw a clock, and they draw half of the clock with numbers 1, 2, 3 until 6, and then the other half is missing. Say, draw a flower for me. You give them an image or a flower, and they just make the petals all on one side, and then half the other side doesn't have anything. So that is because it is not part of that visual field, and they can't see it. They don't think it is there. And in some cases, the person is not even aware that their own arm, for example, is part of their body. One of the professors who actually was one of the main people to first diagnose this problem. He was working in Florida, and there was an engineer who had a stroke. So, and that stroke was right-sided, and he had, paralysis basically on the left side of the body, including his arm was totally paralyzed. So he will be, sitting there, and his arm is thrown off, and it was, he thought all the time that arm belonged to another person on the next bed on the other side of the room. And he would, keep pushing, so the nurses would come and take his arm and put it next, to him or in him. And then he would wake up and say, what is this person throwing his arm on me for? And he would take that arm and throw it off the bed angrily. So, and then eventually the neurologist said, when they told him about that, he said, okay, I'd like to see him. They said, he said to the neurologist, I don't have any desserts here, and that is this, hospital is such and such, and he started complaining. So the neurologist said, okay, I'd like to come and observe him eating. He spoke with the nurses. They said, oh, we give him desserts all the time. He never eats them. So the neurologist watched, and the desserts all the time were on the left side of the tray. So he would eat, the patient would eat on the right half of the tray, on the right side, he would eat everything, and on the left, whatever there is, he doesn't even see it, he doesn't recognize anything there. Because, that stroke basically killed that visual field here, and also the other side of the body, right? Contralateral field is all. And so this is where, he started diagnosing the prosopagnosias that involve the visual difficulties, and that affects perception as well, because the person thinks like someone else is throwing his arm on me. But the neurologist said, as soon as, he saw that, and then he turned, the guy said, the engineer said, well, didn't I tell you they never give me dessert? So I said, oh, we'll get you some dessert. So he took the tray and rotated it. And then he said, the guy looked and he was surprised. Wow, so thank you, you helped me. So he told basically the nurses to just make sure to rotate the trays and kind of make sure that he sees things. So they would have hemi or hemi inattention or hemi neglect, which is they wouldn't, would have that left side, for example. They would not be aware of many of the structures, and they wouldn't, be able to pay attention to things on the left visual field. So this gives us a good introduction to strokes and to aphasias. And when we speak later about the aphasias, we'll go back and take the second half of the appendix, and we'll discuss how how damage to each of these arteries, cerebral arteries, is going to cause a particular set of symptoms that we need to know. So when you see these symptoms, you are going to have the ability to diagnose them and say, this most likely is resulting from, or it means this particular area of the brain, left or right, it has the damage. So it is really a great way to understand how to make a diagnosis and how the symptoms originate and what is the best way to design interventions and evaluations and so on. So I will be posting the next set at some point before the end of the week. So thank you, and I hope that you view this more than once and understand the material. Come to class with questions. Thank you.